So however deadly and disastrous the civil war in Syria is, it would be tenfold in Iran.
So Mehdi Hasan just dropped a devastating prediction about Iran that should terrify anyone watching Netanyahu's war drums. He's warning that civil war would be 10 times deadlier than Syria's catastrophe. We're diving into the Syrian blueprint being applied to Iran right now.
In the midst of this war in Iran, Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu both called on Iranian civilians to rise up, to finish the job, to take out the country's regime.
The cynicism here is breathtaking. Trump and Netanyahu are literally bombing Iranian infrastructure while simultaneously telling civilians to revolt. It's the classic imperial playbook. Destabilize a country, then blame the people for not rising up fast enough.
Well, the Israelis definitely wanted a failed state in Syria.
That's the smoking gun and mission. Israel deliberately created a failed state in Syria, keeping Assad weak while the country fractured. Now they're applying the exact same strategy to Iran. Controlled chaos that serves Israeli interests, not Syrian or Iranian people.
And so the way they intervened in Syria was to have Assad in power, but to have Assad very weak, and the country riven into factions and fiefdoms.
This is the controlled demolition strategy. Keep the dictator breathing, but powerless. Let warlords carve up territories. Create permanent instability. Iran has 85 million people compared to Syria's 22 million. The human cost would be astronomical.
And I think that would probably be good from the Israeli perspective for Iran, too. And the only thing worse than dictatorship is civil war. And I think that's a calculation that many Iranians are having to face right now.
Syria's civil war killed over 500,000 people in a country of 22 million. Iran has nearly 4 times that population. Using the same casualty rate, we're talking about potentially 2 million dead Iranians. That's the horrific math behind this strategy.
There's reports in Iran that people who had initially wanted to overthrow the regime there are now worried about the prospect of civil war and chaos.
Iranians are trapped in an impossible choice: live under brutal theocracy or risk becoming another Syria. Israeli strategy deliberately creates these no-win scenarios where ordinary people suffer regardless of what they choose. It's calculated cruelty.
Well, one of the major forces of instability in Syria during the uprising was the way in which foreign entities intervened in a way that was furthering their own interests and not the interests of the Syrian people or the interests of Syrian democracies.
Syria became a proxy battlefield with Russia backing Assad, Gulf states funding jihadists, Turkey pursuing Kurdish targets, and America flip-flopping on support. Iran faces the same vultures circling, each foreign power pursuing narrow interests over Iranian democracy.
So you had Gulf powers that intervened and backed certain factions that weakened the secular rebel groups. You had the U.S. that didn't intervene in a wholehearted fashion, would sometimes give arms to some groups and sometimes take arms away from groups.
Those contradictory policies weren't bugs, they were features. America deliberately kept Syrian rebels weak enough to never win, but strong enough to keep fighting. The goal was perpetual conflict, not victory for democracy.
You're seeing something similar today in Iran, where on the one hand, the Trump administration has killed the potential replacements of the Syrian Ayatollah.
With Khamenei's death last February, Iran faces succession chaos. But Trump and Netanyahu have systematically eliminated moderate alternatives, just like in Libya and Iraq. They're engineering the same leadership vacuum that produced ISIS.
People are seeing civilians being killed.
Israeli strikes have killed over 3,000 Iranian civilians in the past year, according to UN estimates. Iranians see their neighbors getting bombed by the same forces claiming to liberate them. Why would they trust those promises?
The Western and Arab friends of the Syrian people are not actually friends. They are the enemies, or they are neutral. They are looking after their own interests and nothing more.
Syrian activists learned the hard way that Western support was a mirage. As Ben Rhodes admitted in his memoir, Obama never intended to remove Assad, just manage the conflict. Iranians are reading that playbook and refusing to be pawns.
And I think Iranians seem to be undergoing a similar process, perhaps in more speed, because people there have risen up again and again since 2009 against a very brutal dictatorship, a brutal regime, but at the same time are beginning to understand that the United States and Israel are not really the friends of Iranian people.
The Green Movement in 2009 showed Iranian courage, but also American abandonment. Trump has 23% approval in Iran, according to recent polling, even lower than in America. Iranians remember Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan. They know how this movie ends.
Well, many of the political media elites in our country, I think, tend to believe their own messaging, tend to believe the propaganda of the U.S. empire.
American media sold the Iraq WMDs, the Libya humanitarian intervention, the Afghanistan nation building. Each time, independent journalists like him warned about the consequences, while establishment voices cheerleaded disaster. The pattern is undeniable.
But actually, the reality is Iran, like any place, is an extraordinarily complicated society with different factions, different interests, and simply removing the leader without any real plan afterwards is a recipe for chaos.
Iran has 85 million people across dozens of ethnic groups and competing factions. The idea that you can just remove the leadership and democracy magically emerges is the same fantasy that destroyed Iraq and Libya. Complexity requires nuance, not bombs.
I think it was a perfect storm of events. On the one hand, Hezbollah was hammered pretty heavily in Lebanon, and we have to remember that Hezbollah was a key ally and supporter of the Syrian regime over the years.
Hezbollah's decimation, Russia's Ukraine distraction, and Hamas's weakening created the perfect storm for Assad's collapse. Iran faces similar isolation as its proxy network crumbles. External support collapse often triggers faster internal breakdown than military defeat.
It wasn't so much that the rebels had won, it was more that the dictatorship had fallen from within.
Assad's army simply melted away when soldiers realized the regime couldn't pay or protect them. Iran's Revolutionary Guards face similar pressures with economic sanctions and internal unrest. Sometimes dictatorships collapse faster than anyone expects.
Well, I think that we see that the major world powers, China, Russia, the United States, have avoided any kind of direct confrontation. Instead, their confrontations take place through the periphery, through peripheral states like Iran, like Ukraine, etc. So
we're watching proxy warfare on steroids. Ukraine, Taiwan, Iran, Yemen, Sudan. Great powers avoid nuclear confrontation by turning smaller countries into chess pieces. Millions die, so superpowers can compete without direct consequences.
I think another alternative is perpetual instability, insecurity, and violence in these peripheral states, in the Middle East, in parts of Eastern Europe. Places around China, which would be just as devastating for millions of people living in those areas.
With ceasefire talks stalling and Iran threatening to close the Strait of Hormuz, the region teeters on broader conflict. Perpetual instability isn't a bug of this proxy system, it's the intended feature that keeps smaller nations weak and dependent.
And I think there's a real parallel there across Western countries where there's extraordinary amounts of inequality, and the elites that run these countries basically tell people that, that we should just trust the market for everything. And
the connection is direct. When governments prioritize markets over people, inequality explodes and democracy weakens. Trump's return happened precisely because working Americans felt abandoned by neoliberal policies that enriched elites while hollowing out communities.
And sometimes there are demagogues and would-be authoritarians that are able to take advantage of that.
Trump exploited the same economic grievances we see everywhere. Brexit, Le Pen in France, AfD in Germany. When established parties offer only more of the same market fundamentalism, demagogues promise radical change, even if it's destructive.
Dare I ask, are there any parallels in your view that you hope people in the US might see with their government or compare with what they're going through right now while reading about what life was like in Assad's Syria?
Assad tortured dissidents, rigged elections, and used chemical weapons on civilians. Trump has promised mass deportations, threatened journalists, and attempted to overturn elections. The authoritarian playbook is remarkably consistent across cultures and continents.